It began with something so small, so trivial, that most people wouldn't have believed it could ignite months of chaos. A single parking spot. Just a stretch of cracked asphalt bordered by two faded yellow lines in front of a modest apartment building. Yet for Marcus Williams, a hard-working black father who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade, that space represented more than convenience. It was stability. After 12-hour shifts, managing warehouse logistics, knowing he could pull into that space was like an exhale. It meant unloading groceries without dragging them half a block, carrying his daughter upstairs without waking her, and avoiding late-night walks under the flickering street lamps. It was more than a spot. It was home. But one morning, that fragile comfort was stolen. When Marcus pulled into the lot, his spot was gone, not physically but occupied by a gleaming, oversized pickup truck that clearly didn't belong. Its chrome grille seemed to glint smugly under the sun, as if mocking him. Standing nearby was Greg, the new neighbor. Greg was everything Marcus wasn't: loud, entitled, and eager to make himself known. Where Marcus moved with quiet humility, Greg exuded arrogance, a man who believed the world bent to him. At first Marcus brushed it off. Maybe it was a mistake, a one-time inconvenience. He parked across the street, telling himself not to make it bigger than it was. But the next day, the truck was there again. And the next. By the end of the week, the theft had become routine. Greg had claimed the spot as his own, like planting a flag on stolen ground. Each night, Marcus returned from work only to circle blocks away, searching for somewhere else to park. Sometimes he ended up half a mile from home, carrying heavy grocery bags down cracked sidewalks, sometimes with his 6-year-old daughter. Layla, asleep in the back seat, became a ritual of exhaustion. What once was comfort now turned into a nightly grind of inconvenience and silent humiliation. The grief Marcus felt wasn't about asphalt and yellow paint. For black families like his, respect in daily life often came chipped away in these small unspoken battles. It wasn't just the loss of a parking spot. It was the reminder of how easily their needs, their comfort, could be dismissed. Marcus had worked hard, paid his rent on time, and never caused trouble. Yet here he was being erased by someone too arrogant to care. Greg's arrogance didn't stop at the theft. Within days, Marcus began finding notes left on his windshield. They weren't threats, not exactly, but the tone dripped with condescension. "You should find another spot. This one's taken," or "first come, first served." It was as though Greg enjoyed rubbing salt in the wound, reminding Marcus of his supposed insignificance. Angela, Marcus's wife, urged patience. She was calm and measured, a woman used to keeping her composure. As a respected county judge, she had mastered restraint. She reminded Marcus that escalation rarely ended well, especially for black men in neighborhoods where even the smallest confrontation could spiral. But patience didn't make the nightly grind any easier. Each time Marcus carried Layla's limp body up 3 flights of stairs after parking blocks away. Each time Angela sighed as she looked out the window to see Greg's truck gleaming arrogantly in their spot. Marcus felt the sting of humiliation deepen. One evening, Marcus arrived home late from an overtime shift. Rain hammered the streets, soaking everything in sight. Exhausted, he turned into the lot with a desperate hope. Maybe Greg had parked elsewhere. Maybe the spot was free. Instead, Greg's truck sat there, lights off, immovable as stone. Marcus drove around the block, heart sinking with every turn. Every other space was full. He ended up parking nearly 4 blocks away. With no umbrella, Marcus wrapped Layla in his coat, shielding her tiny frame as the storm drenched him. His shoes filled with water as he trudged through puddles, his arms aching under her weight. By the time they reached their apartment, Layla stirred, coughing from the cold. Angela rushed to meet them at the door, her eyes widening with concern. Marcus, dripping wet, stood in silence, anger simmering beneath his exhaustion. That night, as Layla sniffled under blankets, Marcus sat in the dark living room replaying the walk. It wasn't just about wet clothes or aching arms. Greg's selfishness had crossed into something heavier: his family's health, their dignity, and their basic sense of peace. And Marcus realized he wasn't just tired, he was grieving. Grieving the respect he thought his years in the neighborhood had earned. Grieving the simple routines of safety and comfort that had been stolen. Grieving the idea that no matter how hard he worked, there would always be someone like Greg ready to remind him that his peace didn't matter. Angela tried to soothe him, her hand resting gently on his arm, her voice soft with reason. But Marcus could see it in her eyes. She was growing weary too. She might not have said it aloud, but she understood the sting. In her courtroom, she dealt with disputes over fairness every day. But at home, watching her husband shoulder the weight of disrespect, even her patience was wearing thin. And though neither of them knew it yet, her role in this conflict would become far more than that of a supportive partner. Fate was already aligning the pieces for a confrontation that would stretch far beyond the parking lot. For Marcus, that night marked an unspoken vow. He would no longer let Greg rob him of his peace. He would no longer let entitlement dictate his family's comfort. What started as grief was hardening into determination. But Marcus didn't know that Greg's arrogance was only beginning. Soon his neighbor's entitlement would grow into recklessness, pulling them into a battle that would escalate from asphalt to the courtroom. And when the day came, Greg would discover the truth that turned this petty war upside down. The very judge presiding over his future was the woman whose family he had disrespected. The parking spot was only the beginning. The parking spot should have been the end of it. A petty squabble between neighbors, frustrating but survivable. But Greg was the kind of man who didn't just take. He pressed, he tested boundaries, and he relished in making his presence known. And soon what began with asphalt lines and stolen convenience transformed into a deliberate campaign of intimidation. It started small, like embers flickering before a blaze. Marcus noticed scratches on his car door, faint at first, then deeper, the kind that came from keys dragged intentionally across paint. At first he doubted himself. Maybe it was kids playing in the lot, maybe it was just bad luck. But then came the morning he walked out to find one of his tires deflated, the air hissing out from a neat puncture hole. His stomach twisted as he stared at the rubber, the realization dawning that this was no accident. Greg, meanwhile, strutted through the lot like he owned it. The truck sat in the stolen spot every day, polished, spotless, and always gleaming under the sun as if to remind Marcus of what was his and what wasn't. Neighbors began whispering too. Some shook their heads with sympathy, offering quiet words of support, but no one dared confront Greg directly. Others sided with him, muttering that parking wasn't assigned, that Marcus should stop making it a big deal. It was a bitter pill for Marcus. He had lived there nearly 10 years, longer than most of the tenants combined. He had shoveled snow in the winters, helped elderly neighbors carry groceries up the stairs, and paid his dues in sweat and patience. Yet in a matter of weeks, Greg's swagger and entitlement had unraveled that goodwill. It was as though Marcus had become invisible, his history erased by the sheer volume of Greg's arrogance. Angela saw the toll it was taking on her husband. Each night, when he trudged up the stairs with his shoulders hunched and his jaw clenched, she recognized the silent weight of injustice pressing down on him. She knew too well the way these battles stacked up in a black man's life, how constant slights chipped away at dignity. For Marcus, it wasn't just about losing convenience. It was about being disrespected in his own community and being silenced when he had every right to be heard. The turning point came one Saturday morning when Marcus, desperate to reclaim even a shred of normalcy, decided to park in the spot before Greg returned. He woke up early, drove around the block, and pulled into the space just after sunrise. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small spark of victory, a reminder that this was still his home. But when Greg arrived later that day, the confrontation wasn't silent. Shouts carried through the lot as Greg stormed up to Marcus's car, gesturing wildly, his face twisted with rage. Marcus kept his distance, his heart pounding as he stood on the balcony above, watching Greg scream into the empty air. Though Marcus hadn't spoken a word, Greg acted as though his very presence was an offense. Later that afternoon, Marcus found another note tucked under his windshield wiper. This one wasn't smug, it was threatening. "You think you can play games with me? Keep it up and see what happens." Angela read the note with narrowed eyes, her calm demeanor slipping for just a moment. She placed the paper on the counter with deliberate care, but Marcus could see the storm behind her silence. She had spent her career mediating disputes, ensuring fairness, and upholding justice. But here, in her own home, she was powerless to stop a bully from turning their lives upside down. The harassment grew bolder, loud music blasting late at night, trash accidentally spilling across their front steps, and Greg's friends parking deliberately close to Marcus's car, so he had to squeeze into the driver's seat. Each act was designed to provoke, to remind Marcus of who held power. One night, after yet another exhausting search for parking, Marcus returned to find Layla sitting by the window, her small face pressed against the glass. "Daddy, why is that man so mean to us?" she asked when he came inside. The question pierced deeper than any threat. It was one thing for Marcus to shoulder the humiliation himself, but watching his daughter witness their mistreatment was unbearable. By now, Marcus had started documenting everything: photos of the scratches on his car, copies of the notes, dates, times, patterns. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was evidence. He knew how these stories played out if you didn't have proof. The word of a black man against a loud, entitled neighbor rarely ended in fairness. Still, the weight of injustice pressed harder with each passing day. Marcus was the one inconvenienced, the one bending, the one carrying groceries across blocks of cracked sidewalk, while Greg enjoyed the convenience of a stolen spot. He was the one paying full rent while his peace was stolen piece by piece. Angela reminded him that bullies often dug their own graves, but Marcus struggled to see the light through the growing fog of frustration. He felt trapped. Every choice seemed like losing. Ignore Greg and he loses his dignity. Confront him and he risked escalation that could spiral out of control. The neighborhood's silence only deepened the sting. Where were the voices that once praised him for helping shovel snow, for fixing the broken fence, and for being the dependable neighbor? Now, when he needed support, he was left to stand alone. But Marcus didn't yet know that Greg's arrogance would stretch further than stolen asphalt. He didn't know that the entitlement festering in his neighbor would soon spill into recklessness that reached beyond the parking lot, into places where the law had real weight. And what Greg didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that the quiet woman standing beside Marcus every night wasn't just another tenant. She was Judge Angela Williams, a woman whose courtroom he would one day enter. The pieces were aligning, and the stage for something bigger was being set. What began as petty theft had transformed into open harassment, and soon it would cross a line that even Greg couldn't swagger his way past. The injustice was unfolding, step by deliberate step, and it was about to lead straight into tension that neither man could avoid. For weeks Marcus tried to grit his teeth and endure. He told himself that things couldn't get worse, that at some point Greg would grow tired of the game and move on. But entitlement rarely retreats. When given space, it spreads like wildfire, and Greg's sense of superiority only grew bolder with time. What began as scratches and notes soon turned into open hostility. Marcus returned home one evening to find his car cornered in so tightly by Greg's truck that he couldn't maneuver out. He stood in the dim glow of the street lamp, staring at the deliberate placement, realizing this wasn't just harassment anymore. It was Greg's way of announcing control. The space, the asphalt, the very lot itself had become his stage, and Marcus was his unwilling audience. The neighborhood was beginning to fracture under the weight of Greg's actions. On one side were those who shook their heads in disapproval but refused to intervene, afraid of becoming targets themselves. On the other side were those who quietly relished Greg's audacity, finding satisfaction in his boldness even as it tore apart community peace. And then there was Marcus, isolated at the center of it all, the man forced to swallow his pride while his neighbors pretended not to see. For black families like the Williamses, silence was never neutral. Angela knew this truth well. Injustice left unchallenged was permission, and she had seen it play out in courtroom after courtroom. What stung most wasn't only Greg's arrogance, but the neighborhood's willingness to let it fester. Each ignored note, each whispered, "It's not my problem," was a second betrayal, not just by Greg, but by the very people they had lived beside for years. The escalation wasn't confined to parking anymore. Greg began using his truck as a weapon of intimidation, revving the engine loudly whenever Marcus walked past, idling at the edge of the lot like a predator waiting to pounce. Once, as Marcus carried groceries with Layla skipping beside him, Greg gunned the engine so suddenly that Layla stumbled, wide-eyed and frightened. Marcus's hands clenched around the paper bags, rage boiling as oranges spilled across the concrete. That moment marked a shift. Greg wasn't just targeting Marcus's pride anymore, he was endangering his family. Angela's patience began to crack. She had spent her life mediating conflict with precision and fairness, but now she found herself lying awake at night, rehearsing the lines of every note, every threat. The escalation had reached their doorstep, and though Marcus tried to shield her, Angela knew the truth. They were living in a war zone disguised as a neighborhood. Greg's arrogance spilled further when he began boasting to others about his victories. Marcus overheard fragments of conversations, Greg laughing about how he taught that guy a lesson, or how he put him in his place. The casual cruelty struck like a hammer. It wasn't enough for Greg to bully. He needed an audience, a stage for his bravado. The tension thickened, stretching beyond Marcus's household. Other tenants began whispering about late-night disturbances, Greg's music blaring until 3 a.m., arguments spilling into Thelot, and beer bottles left shattered across walkways. Yet when anyone raised concerns, Greg deflected blame, spinning himself as the victim of jealous neighbors. It was a classic performance, and too many were willing to believe him. For Marcus, the walls were closing in. Each day began with scanning his car Ford image. Each evening ended with Layla asking questions he couldn't answer. Why no one stopped them and why people let wrongness stand. And beneath his anger was something heavier. The weight of history, the ache of generations who had been told to endure, to bend, to swallow injustice for the sake of peace. But Marcus wasn't built to bend forever. The documentation he had begun compiling was growing into a thick file, photos of damage, copies of threatening notes, and detailed logs of incidents. It was evidence, cold and undeniable, though still hidden in the drawer of his desk. To the world he remained silent, but inside, the pressure was building to a breaking point. The escalation reached its peak one Friday evening. Marcus returned, home to find his car's windshield cracked, a spiderweb of glass catching the last glow of daylight. The note on the hood was short and smug. "You're not welcome here." Neighbors gathered in hushed circles, watching Marcus's reaction. Some looked away, others pretended to care but offered no help. And through it all, Greg leaned against his truck with a smirk, arms crossed, reveling in the chaos he had created. That night, Marcus sat in the dark living room, the broken glass still etched in his mind. Angela sat beside him, her hand steady on his knee, her presence quiet but powerful. She didn't need to say the words. He could feel them in the silence. This has gone too far. It will not go unanswered. The escalation had transformed the neighborhood into a stage of tension and fear. Greg believed he had won, that his intimidation had secured dominance not just over Marcus, but over everyone too afraid to act. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the evidence Marcus had collected, paired with Angela's position and resolve, was already forming into a strategy that would pierce through the silence. The Williams family was no longer just enduring, they were preparing. And when the moment came, Greg would realize that the parking spot he fought so hard to claim was nothing compared to what he stood to lose. For weeks, Marcus had been the quiet target, carrying the weight of every slight and insult like bricks on his back. But when the windshield shattered and the smug note was left behind, something shifted deep inside him. Endurance had carried him this far, but endurance alone would not protect his family. That night, as the silence of the house wrapped around him, Marcus made a decision. He was done being silent. Angela had already sensed the shift before he said a word. Years of reading juries, judges, and defendants had taught her to detect the smallest changes in body language, and she saw it in her husband's posture. His shoulders no longer slumped with defeat, but squared with purpose. The broken glass wasn't just an act of vandalism. It was a turning point, and together they were ready to fight back. Marcus opened the drawer of his desk and laid out the evidence he had collected. Photos of scratches, recordings of revving, engines, copies of every note, and detailed logs of times and dates. Angela leafed through them slowly, her expression sharp with focus. The file wasn't just proof, it was a weapon. Every page told a story of intimidation, a narrative that no smirk or excuse could erase. Angela leaned back, arms folded, her mind already spinning with strategy. She had seen cases collapse because the evidence wasn't airtight, but Marcus's diligence had built something ironclad. This, she thought, is enough to break him. But she knew it wasn't just about winning in court. It was about reclaiming their dignity, about showing Layla that silence doesn't mean surrender. The first step was subtle but powerful. Marcus began making his presence known. No longer did he avert his gaze when passing Greg in the lot. Instead, he looked him directly in the eye, calm and steady. That small shift rattled Greg more than any words could. Bullies thrived on submission, and the absence of it unsettled them. Angela, meanwhile, began leveraging her network. Judges, attorneys, clerks. Her world was one of procedure and power. She didn't announce her plans and didn't need to flex her position. Instead, she quietly consulted with trusted colleagues, ensuring that every move they made would be precise and unstoppable. Greg had no idea that the woman he dismissed so easily was the very person whose influence could dismantle him. The neighborhood, too, began to notice. Marcus's calm defiance, his refusal to flinch, stirred whispers among those who had once looked away. A few tenants quietly approached him, admitting they too had faced Greg's harassment, late-night noise, blocked driveways, and veiled threats. What once felt like Marcus's isolated battle began to reveal itself as a pattern of abuse stretching across the community. For the first time, Marcus wasn't alone. The turning point wasn't just legal, it was emotional. Marcus began to reclaim spaces Greg had tried to control. He walked with Layla across the lot without quickening his step. He parked deliberately in the contested space, no longer checking nervously over his shoulder. Each action, small but deliberate, was a declaration: you don't own me. You don't own this space. Greg, of course, noticed. The smirk that had once been permanent began to waver. He upped his intimidation, louder music, bolder threats, but his efforts felt desperate, like a man sensing his grip slipping. The more Marcus stood tall, the more Greg revealed himself for what he was, a coward hiding behind bluster. Then came the first ripple of real consequence. Late one night after Greg revved his engine and blocked Marcus's car in again, Marcus called the police. Not with anger, not with panic, but with calm precision. When the officers arrived, Marcus handed them a neatly organized folder detailing not just that night's offense, but months of documented harassment. The officers, often quick to dismiss neighbor disputes, paused at the sheer weight of evidence. Greg tried to spin his usual story, but the calm authority of Marcus's presentation left little room for doubt. For the first time, Greg was on record. The neighborhood buzzed the next morning. Word spread that Marcus had finally stood his ground, that Greg had been forced to back down under police scrutiny. To some, it was a relief. To others, a shock. But for Marcus and Angela, it was the first visible crack in Greg's armor. Still, Angela knew this was just the beginning. Filing reports and confronting harassment wasn't enough. Greg needed to face consequences that couldn't be shrugged off with a laugh or a smirk, and she had the tools to make that happen. One evening, as Marcus tucked Layla into bed, Angela sat at the dining table drafting motions, reviewing statutes, and pulling case law. She worked with the precision of someone who understood the battlefield ahead. This wasn't just about property disputes or broken glass. This was about harassment, endangerment, and violation of tenant rights. And with the evidence Marcus had compiled, the case was airtight. The turning point crystallized when Angela placed the finished file on the table. It wasn't just papers stapled together. It was the blueprint of Greg's undoing. In those pages lay every reckless act, every smear of arrogance, and every threat he had carelessly made. Greg thought he was untouchable because neighbors stayed silent. But silence was no longer his shield. That night, Marcus and Angela exchanged a look across the table. No words were needed. They both understood what came next. Greg believed he was winning a petty war over a parking spot. What he didn't know was that the fight had left the pavement and entered a courtroom, a place where arrogance held no power and where Angela's steady hand could unravel everything he had built. The turning point had arrived. The Williams family was no longer enduring, no longer bracing for the next blow. They were moving forward with precision, with evidence, and with resolve. And as Greg reveled in what he thought was dominance, he was already standing on the edge of his own downfall. The days that followed the police report felt different. For the first time in months, Marcus walked through the parking lot without the weight of dread on his shoulders. The broken glass had been swept away, the damage repaired, but the memory of humiliation still lingered. Now, though, it no longer burned as defeat, it ignited as fuel. Angela had always told her husband that justice wasn't won overnight, and she was right. The report was only the first step. To truly end Greg's reign of harassment, they needed more than isolated calls to the police. They needed to expose his behavior in a way that no one, not the apartment board, not law enforcement, not even Greg himself, could ignore. Marcus kept his routine steady but purposeful. Each day he documented Greg's every move with quiet precision. When Greg parked across two spaces, Marcus snapped photos. When Greg revved his engine late at night, Marcus recorded the noise. When Greg hurled subtle threats, Marcus jotted down the exact words and times. It wasn't just note-taking anymore. It was building a wall of evidence that could not be climbed. Meanwhile, Angela's strategy grew sharper. At the courthouse, between her official cases, she quietly consulted colleagues who specialized in tenant rights. She gathered precedents, studied statutes, and built arguments tailored to Marcus's situation. Every page of law she reviewed was another nail in Greg's coffin. She knew bullies like him relied on intimidation, but the law was her battleground, and on that ground she was unbeatable. The neighborhood began to shift as well. Marcus's quiet resistance had inspired others to speak. A family across the courtyard confessed Greg had once threatened to slash their tires. An elderly tenant admitted she avoided parking in certain spaces to keep the peace with him. Slowly, stories poured in, each one weaving into the larger tapestry of Greg's intimidation. Marcus gathered these testimonies with care, his file growing thicker, stronger, and undeniable. Greg noticed the change. The smirk that had once defined his face now faltered, replaced with narrowed eyes that darted between Marcus's camera and notebook. He tried escalating his intimidation, leaving trash bags near Marcus's door, blaring music at impossible hours, but each act only strengthened the record against him. Every outburst was no longer an annoyance, it was another piece of evidence added to the growing arsenal. Angela knew the timing had to be perfect. Striking too soon could risk their case, but waiting too long would allow Greg to regroup. So she prepared quietly, drafting motions, collecting affidavits, and stitching together a legal strategy so airtight it would leave Greg no room to breathe. The real fight began when Angela filed the official complaint. It wasn't just about harassment or vandalism. It was about endangerment, intimidation, and violation of tenant protections. The complaint carried the weight of months of evidence, names of witnesses, and a narrative so compelling that even the most skeptical reader would see Greg for what he was, a bully who had gone unchecked too long. When Greg was served with the notice, his bravado cracked. For the first time he wasn't smirking or laughing. He was pale, caught off guard, clutching the papers like they might dissolve in his hands. To him, the parking war had always been a game of dominance. Now it was real. But Marcus and Angela weren't finished. Filing the complaint was the opening salvo. Next came the strategy of exposure. They attended tenant board meetings calmly, presenting the evidence to other residents. Neighbors who had once stayed silent found courage, standing alongside Marcus as they described their own encounters with Greg. The room that had once been filled with Greg's intimidating presence now turned against him, eyes glaring, voices raised in unity. The board, once reluctant to intervene, had no choice but to act. Greg was no longer a nuisance, he was a liability, and liability demanded consequences. They issued warnings, fines, and restrictions, each one chipping away at the control Greg thought he had. Marcus could see it, the unraveling. Greg's once cocky strut had turned into defensive glances, his loud boasts now replaced by hurried excuses. The walls of arrogance he had built around himself were collapsing brick by brick, and Marcus was there to watch every piece fall. The fight back wasn't just legal or procedural, it was personal. Marcus began reclaiming the spaces Greg had stolen. He parked confidently in his rightful spot, his camera always ready, his posture unyielding. Angela accompanied him some evenings, their unity a visible shield against Greg's attempts at intimidation. Their presence alone was a declaration. We are not afraid of you anymore. As the hearing date loomed, Angela sharpened her strategy further. She prepared witness lists, highlighted statutes, and rehearsed arguments with the precision of a general, planning a battle. She knew Greg would try to bluster, to spin, to paint himself as a victim, but she also knew the law was clear, the evidence undeniable, and the tide irreversible. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Some feared retaliation, while others whispered their relief that someone had finally stood up to Greg. To Marcus, it didn't matter. What mattered was that his family was no longer suffering in silence. What mattered was that Layla would grow up knowing her parents fought back against injustice, no matter how small or petty it seemed. One evening, As Marcus closed his notebook, filled with months of evidence, Angela placed her hand over his. The fight back wasn't just about victory, it was about survival, dignity, and reclaiming peace. And as they looked across the courtyard at Greg's darkened window, they knew the battle was reaching its peak. Greg thought he had been playing a game, but the Williams family had turned the game into a war, and the battlefield was no longer the parking lot. It was a courtroom, and in that arena the rules were different, and Greg had no idea just how outmatched he truly was. The courthouse buzzed with a quiet tension on the morning of Greg's hearing. For Marcus, the moment felt surreal. Months of torment, humiliation, and intimidation had led to this single day. He wasn't just walking into a legal proceeding. He was walking into the culmination of every sleepless night, every notebook entry, and every photograph snapped in defiance. Angela walked beside him, her steps measured, her face composed. Though she wasn't presiding over the case, a conflict of interest made that impossible. Her presence was undeniable. Her reputation in the courthouse carried weight, and Greg would soon realize just how small his bluster looked under the shadow of real authority. Inside, the courtroom carried its usual gravity. Oak benches polished by decades of use, fluorescent. Lights buzzing softly above, and the air thick with anticipation. Neighbors filled the gallery seats, some out of curiosity, others out of solidarity. Whispers rippled as Greg entered, his once cocky demeanor dimmed. His jaw was tight, his suit ill-fitted, and his eyes darted around the room as though searching for an escape. The judge entered, gavel striking. The room stilled. This was no longer about petty parking disputes or neighborhood harassment. This was about accountability. The evidence Angela had helped compile spoke louder than any argument Greg could muster. Photographs of vandalized cars, timestamps of noise complaints, written testimonies from neighbors, each piece stacked neatly into an undeniable mountain. Marcus's meticulous documentation transformed from scribbles in a notebook to exhibits that told a story of relentless intimidation. Greg's defense tried to spin the narrative, painting Marcus as overly sensitive, exaggerating minor inconveniences, but the weight of evidence crushed those claims instantly. One by one, neighbors testified, their voices trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. The elderly woman feared leaving her car in the lot. The young couple who had endured Greg's taunts. The father worried for his children's safety. Together they painted a portrait of Greg not as a misunderstood neighbor, but as a calculated bully. Marcus sat silently, his heart pounding with every testimony. For so long he had carried the burden of proof alone. Now hearing others speak, he realized this fight had never been his alone. The neighborhood had been wounded too, and now, together, they were rising. Greg's frustration boiled over. His voice grew louder, his words more erratic. He rolled. His eyes scoffed at testimonies and even muttered under his breath. What once passed for intimidation in the courtyard now looked childish, even dangerous under the judge's steady gaze. The mask of confidence he had worn for so long was slipping, and beneath it lay only desperation. When the judge called Marcus forward, the room hushed. Marcus spoke calmly, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. He recounted the months of harassment, the nights he couldn't sleep, and the day he found his windshield shattered. He spoke of Layla, of wanting to protect his daughter from growing up in fear. And finally he spoke of dignity, of refusing to let someone strip it away no matter how powerful they seemed. The judge listened intently, nodding slightly as Marcus laid down the truth. By the time he finished, the courtroom felt heavier, the air thick with the undeniable reality of Greg's actions. The verdict came swiftly. The court ruled in Marcus's favor, recognizing Greg's harassment as deliberate, sustained, and unlawful. Greg was ordered to pay restitution for damages face steep fines, and comply with strict behavioral restrictions within the complex. The board, under legal advisement, moved to begin proceedings to evict him entirely. But perhaps the most poetic justice came in the judge's final statement. Greg, the man who had weaponized fear against his neighbors, was publicly reprimanded for his behavior. His arrogance, once his armor, had become his downfall. As the gavel struck for the last time, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in months: release. The weight on his chest lifted. The fight was over. Justice had been delivered. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered around Marcus and Angela, offering handshakes, hugs, and words of gratitude. They weren't just thanking him for standing up for himself. They were thanking him for standing up for all of them. The silent suffering that had plagued the community was broken, replaced with a shared sense of empowerment. Greg, meanwhile, exited through the opposite doors, his shoulders slumped, his future uncertain. The man who had once strutted across the parking lot like he owned it all now looked smaller than ever. He had underestimated Marcus, underestimated Angela, and most of all, underestimated the power of truth. That night, the parking lot felt different. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Marcus pulled into his rightful spot without hesitation. The engine quieted, the night was calm, and for once, there was no lingering dread. Angela stepped out beside him, Layla's small hand tucked into hers. They walked inside together, not as victims but as victors. The war had been long, the scars still raw, but Marcus knew one thing for certain. They had faced injustice and refused to bow to it. They had fought, not with fists or anger, but with truth, persistence, and unity. And in the end, that was stronger than any intimidation Greg could wield. For every sleepless night, for every insult endured, for every broken piece of glass, justice had been delivered. And as the quiet hum of the neighborhood settled back into peace, Marcus realized the fight had never been about a parking spot. It had always been about something bigger: dignity, resilience, and the unshakable belief that no bully, no matter how entitled, could take those things away. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.